for this to start playing. Why is it not playing? Oh, jeez. Sorry, there's something wrong with this connection. I'm going to have to find it another way. Sorry.
Or we can do without it.
Well, it's tradition now, isn't it?
Tradition we can do without.
Hold on. Sorry, apologies. I got it now. Hold on.
And you've heard that from Andrew just now. But this was aimed at the country. When Keir said, we're the party of sound money, we're the party of home ownership, he was saying Thatcherites are safe to come home to the Labour Party. He was actually saying, he's defining a centre, a radical centre, and there's lots of things about engaging with the 21st century.
So you're saying Thatcherites could actually come home to the Labour Party?
I don't think anybody who's a Thatcherite can believe in Liz Truss or Kwasi Kwarteng's economic policy. What Keir had to say to the country was, you're safe with a Labour government. We've uprooted anti-Semitism, biggest standing ovation of the afternoon. We've changed our party. We're occupying the centre ground, and it spreads quite a long way now. And I think Andrew again was right about that. The centre is large.
Good evening, comrades. Welcome to Have Your Say on the aftermath of the Labour Party conference, which we discussed in some detail at last week's show, with a number of contributions by Alan Simpson and a visitor to Labour Party conference. And we dealt with that delusion that we discussed, that we had in the intro, which was the idea, which is peddled by Andrew Fisher, Momentum, Owen Jones, that Labour Party conference somehow was a victory for the left, steps were made in the right direction, etc. So we dealt with that at some length and took a look at, for example, the green policy that was agreed at the conference, and Alan Simpson did a very good job, I think, exposing this as a, to put it mildly, not very convincing. So we want to today discuss with the audience, with you guys, what you thought of the program and what you think where we should go after conference. And we've got with us John Pickard today, who's the editor of Left Horizons, and as he just told us, used to be even the editor of Militant and was expelled in 1991 for the first time, probably not for the last time. Who knows what will happen? It's the Labour Party is a difficult home at the moment, a political home. But we want to take a look with John now as the introduction discussion at another delusion, which we touched upon last week, but we want to discuss this a bit further in this week's program. And that is the delusion, which I think is a delusion, probably some in the audience don't agree, that the Labour Party is dead. We've been told by many people, from Chris Williamson to George Galloway, etc., that clearly after Labour Party conference, there's no doubt Labour Party is dead. John, you disagree with that. Can you outline your reasons why?
Yes, well, Tina, the invite came to me on the strength of an article I wrote for Left Horizons. And really, it's part of a series of articles I wrote because I was at the conference up until Tuesday anyway. So really, if any comrades want to have a better insight, because I've only got 5 or 6 minutes, then they should go to those articles. The question is the Labour Party dead? I don't think so. I don't want to repeat the points that you went over in your last discussion, but quite clearly for me, the Labour Party conference was a turning point and the right wing took control. Even as recently as last year, the right wing won some organisational resolutions and some organisational victories, relatively small ones, but on every single political issue, on the national minimum wage, on nationalisation, on the state of Israel, on every single political issue, the left won the votes last year. Now, that wasn't the case this year. And the left was very much in the fringe, literally on the fringe. There were some very good, very large and vibrant fringe meetings, like Enough is Enough, the Tribune rally, the campaign group of MPs rally, and so on. But the voice of the left, even from the rostrum, the voice of the left was nothing like as pronounced as it was even as recently as last year. And I think the Union Jack backdrop to the stage and the national anthem are really symbolic of the change that's taken place. Now, none of this means that the Labour Party, however, is dead. The Labour Party conference coincided with a complete collapse of the Tory vote in the opinion polls. Now, that's not down to Starmer, because people have known for a long time that Starmer has no charisma, and up until the party conference, he had no policies. It's down to the policies of Liz Truss, and particularly the mini budget that was introduced only days before the conference itself. And these opinion polls, some of them are record opinion polls, by the way, showing a huge Labour victory, would indicate that at the time of the next election, Labour's going to win a big majority. Now, of course, things can change. Of course, we recognise that. But we have to go on what we have now, what we see now. Liz Truss has the lowest ratings personally of any Prime Minister going back a long time, I think even worse than Johnson's. And for the man and woman in the street, and this is what I've argued, for the man and woman in the street, the Union Jack backdrop to Labour conference, the machinations of the bureaucracy, the expulsions, the suspensions of CLPs, none of that will make any difference to the ordinary voters in the street. It won't make any difference at all. And just as Labour got 13.5 million votes in 1997 or something like that, I think they're on course to win the same number of votes next time. I think it's likely that Labour will win the election. And I also think it's likely that the election will come before December 2024 when it's due. And so you could argue straight off, how is it possible to describe a party as dead when it's likely to get 12 or 13 million votes? It's not dead. By no means is it dead. The question arises, of course, what about the left? What about the possibility of socialist policies within the Labour Party? It is different, as Tina suggested earlier, to be an activist, to be a socialist, to be a Marxist inside the Labour Party at the present time. You're really swimming against a very, very strong tide. There's no two ways about that. But I think that perspective will change over the course of the next couple of years. Now, the overarching issue, which I haven't got time to go into, but it's without a doubt the overarching issue that will impact on all politics in the next few years is the state of the British economy. British capitalism is facing a crisis of historic proportions. Cuts in living standards. In some cases, it's been argued worse than any cuts going back to the Napoleonic Wars. Cuts in public expenditure. And the dominant issue when Labour is elected, if Labour is elected, will be the economy. And we've heard from John McTiernan, we've heard from Rachel Reeves at conference, we've heard from Starmer and other people that Labour is the policy of fiscal responsibility. So that government, from the very beginning, that Labour government will be a government of crisis. But here's the point. It will not be a repeat of 1997. It will be a repeat. I know history never repeats itself exactly in any event, but it won't be comparable to 1997. It'll be comparable to 1931, when that Labour government broke under the pressure on the one side of the capitalist class to introduce cuts in unemployment benefits and other benefits. But on the other hand, it had the pressure of the working class through the trades unions, through left MPs, through the conference itself, not to implement those things. And it led to an inevitable clash. Now, I think in that kind of scenario, I'm trying to sum it up and very, very quickly, but in that kind of scenario, the Labour Party will be completely different. It's a different scenario, it's a different setup than the one we have now. And the divisions, debates, splits and arguments that will develop in the Labour Party will be completely different to those now. And I think it will be possible once again to get a genuine current of Marxism and of socialism inside the Labour Party. The key is the future. The key is that kind of development. I haven't got time to go into it, but one of the key issues, of course, is how the trades unions develop. And as we see now, there doesn't seem to be any viable alternative outside the Labour Party. And all of those in the Facebook bubble, and it is a bubble, who argue that the Labour Party is dead, cannot point to a single serious possible alternative to the Labour Party out in the real world. I'll stop there.
Thanks, John. I think there's a lot I think we, us three here, agree with in that analysis. You do write in your article that the working class will have to go through a Starmer government, basically, because they will need to go through that, that illusion needs to be exposed. Do you think that's ever really, did that work with Tony Blair? Did the working class have to go through that experience? And if so, what did it teach it, that particular, having to go through? See, I agree with a lot of your analysis, but we're having to vote for a Labour government and campaign for a Labour government. This is perhaps where I'm struggling to follow your argument.
Will I answer that now? Sorry.
Please, yes.
Yeah. Well. I think the point is, Tina, is quite clearly there are illusions in Keir Starmer. The collapse of the support for the Tories is largely due, I would say overwhelmingly due to the economy. But there still is also this issue, this idea put about in the capitalist press that Labour is now electable, that the Labour Party has recaptured the centre ground, that it's a kind of it's a party that's fit to run the country, all that kind of garbage. Now, to a certain extent, that does filter out. That filters out to ordinary voters who don't read politics and political literature in the same way we do. So there are illusions in that kind of leader and that kind of reforming policy. Now, the only way to get rid of those illusions is by experience. I don't know of any other way. You can stand on a street corner and sell newspapers, and you can reach 1 or 2 people in a crowd. You can reach 3 or 4 people the next day, but you will never reach the hundreds of thousands and millions you really need to reach. And the only way you can reach them is by them going through the experience of seeing that the Labour government trying to carry out policies within the framework of capitalism just doesn't work. You do anything within the framework of capitalism, it means cuts in living standards. Now, the reaction that you will get from that will not necessarily and automatically lead to a swing to the left. There will be movements to the right as well. There will be right-wing movements and nationalist movements and xenophobic movements. I recognize that. But I can't see any way that those illusions can be dispelled except by workers going through those kind of experiences.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as a Marxist, like us, you will agree probably that the task of Marxists is to break the working class from laborism and break it from that illusion. Going through the experience of another Labour government that's going to let us down is one way probably to go. Do you think there is any mileage in organizing the left on a principled basis, on a Marxist basis, and to come out with a Marxist program and openly say we're a Marxist?
Well, I don't deny I'm a Marxist. When I talk to Labour Party members in my constituency, I never denied I was a Marxist. So that's never been an issue. Although I'm always a little bit wary of badges and labels that people want to tag on you. I'm always a little bit wary of that. But you just said in your question, Tina, that in relation to dispelling the illusions, that is one way to go. But there isn't another way. That's the point. If millions of people have got illusions in that type of government of reforming capitalism, there is no other alternative except that they go through that experience. There isn't an alternative. If there was another mass party out there, another big party commanding the support of millions of workers, trade union members and so on, it would be a whole different ball game. But we're not there now.
Graham. Sorry, Graham, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. John, it's a breath of fresh air to hear what you've got to say. I'm almost, but not entirely, in full agreement with you. But let me just start by saying, look, it's out of the question that at the next general election, the left can in any way be neutral, when there will be a desperation to try to get rid of this lunatic right-wing government. And for us to say, well, there's no difference between the parties, we wouldn't even get a hearing, and nor would we deserve one. But I think, as far as I'm concerned, the only issue I have with you, John, is that I think you may be being too optimistic about a way back in the party. I don't think this is even like it was with Blair. We have had the experience, and you talk quite rightly about the overriding centrality of experience. We've had the experience of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the party. And it wasn't just our experience, it was the right-wing establishment factions experience in the party. And they are desperate, never, ever to let us back in. And that's the reason for the witch hunt. That's the reason for the expulsions, the suspensions, the closing down of debate. They're never going to let us back in. But that isn't the only issue. And I think there's a contradiction between the fact that I don't think we're going to be let back. When I say not let back in to any area of power, of course we can be party members. You are, I've been expelled, but of course we can get resolutions at conference, but we will not be allowed to get back into any power in the party. But the contradiction is this, that the movement will be turning to Labour because there's no alternative. And there will be these illusions. And so there's an audience for us looking towards within the Labour Party. And so my view is that in the absence of at least the embryo of an alternative to Labour, then we remain orientating still towards the Labour Party. After all, it's still the party to which the key unions are affiliated. We can't ignore that. And sometimes we're in this objective situation where there are actually no immediate answers. When I speak, I often get quite negative comments here and elsewhere on chat saying I'm pessimistic. No, I don't think I am, but I think our responsibility is to say the truth. There is this problem that there's no immediate solution, no immediate answer within the Labour Party, and nothing that anyone is really listening to outside. So I think that the next Labour government, I put it a bit differently, the next Labour government could be a moment when a Starmer right-wing government, Labour government, comes into collision with an emerging trade union resistance. And that period could define the relationship between the Labour Party and the trade unions in a sense that it hasn't changed for over 100 years in real terms. It could do. And I think for us to be absent from being within and orientating to Labour in that period would be a grave dereliction of responsibility.
Mike, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Tina, and hi everyone. It's good to see everyone on a Monday night. I'll try and keep this short because I suspect, Tina, you're seeing lots of people looking to come in. To coin a phrase, the death of the Labour Party has been much exaggerated, and I appreciate that is a great frustration to a lot of people who would like nothing better than to see the party take its place in the dustbin of history. But similar to Graham, I'm looking at the chat box and I'm seeing a lot of frustration about, I guess, what people might see as illusions in the party. We have no illusions in the party of what the party will deliver. Unlike some on the left following conference who expressed the rather, as Tina says, rather a peculiar view that this had been a qualitative shift and that Starmer had moved to the left and we could all celebrate, and by implication we could relax a little bit because our job had been achieved. That's all nonsense, of course, and those are real illusions. But what has not changed and didn't change under Blair, hasn't changed under Starmer, didn't change under previous centrist and right-wing leaders, is the objective character of the party as a workers' party, linked institutionally and historically to the trade union movement. And for many of us, that, of course, is very, very difficult. It's full of contradictions because on the one hand, we have no illusions on what a Labour government will deliver, but we encourage people to vote Labour, particularly at least in moments like this. That's not an eternal prescription. Of course, things change. People on the right of the party encourage us not to vote Labour tactically in some constituencies during Brexit. Many people on the right of the party encourage one another secretly to vote for the Lib Dems. So no one right across the party spectrum is urging for all time socialists to gravitate towards the party or even to vote for the Labour Party. But for as long as there is not a viable alternative, for as long as it is a field of struggle for socialists who want to intervene, and listen, I was in the Labour Party Young Socialists many years ago, John, that essentially was the militant tendency. I was never a member of the militant, but many comrades then and now, they understood, and I think this is what we understand, that the objective character of the party is what makes us keep coming back to it. No illusions in what it will deliver. But as long as millions of working class people have illusions in that party and its capacity to deliver it from the injustices that they daily face, then we have got to address that. We've got to be where working class people are. We've got to be where consciousness is at any one point. And that's difficult, it's frustrating, it's not very glamorous work, it's not the kind of work that perhaps we would prefer to do. but it is where we are. And as long as that's where we are, that is where we have to orientate ourselves, it seems to me.
John, one last question, perhaps before we open up for questions from the floor, is the role of the unions, which is quite crucial in that the affiliation of the union makes the Labour Party a working class party. And yet there is tension there, isn't it? There's the moment with the enough is enough, disaffiliations being discussed, etc. So there is a tension, though. I would have thought that with the prospect of a Labour Party government, the pressure on the union bureaucracies to stay within the Labour Party will be much bigger than to break and support something like enough is enough. How do you see that tension?
Okay, can I respond to some of those points?
Yes, please.
Graham said, I'm sorry if I'm misquoting you, but suggested I was too optimistic. I would say, Graham, there are worse crimes. Believe me, there are worse crimes. And in your introduction, you actually carried a quote from Angela Davis, which is very appropriate. You have to go on believing you can change the system, and you have to go on believing that. Now, I think the left is in retreat. There's no two ways about that. And anyone who thinks otherwise, I think, is living in a dream world. But I was interested in the phrase you said, they're never going to let us back in. But let's bear in mind, back in the days of militant, when I was expelled in 1991, probably up and down the entire country, not more than 200 or 300 supporters of militant were expelled, if that. The mistake Militant made was to march out of the Labour Party. That was the mistake that they made. Now, much the same is true today, because for everyone who's been expelled or suspended, about 1,000 have walked away. The big loss of membership must be pushing up to 250,000 now. Are not people expelled, they're people who are disgusted, or people who are dispirited, disenchanted with the party, and they've walked away. Now, it doesn't really matter what you and I do, Graham. That doesn't really matter. It's whether or not they let us back in. It's whether there will be a move of ordinary working class people into the party and youth who weren't active in politics before. It only took a small spark for Jeremy Corbyn to be elected as Labour leader, and tens of thousands of young people joined the Labour Party. Now imagine if you could get some different spark, something else. I think that kind of resurge back into the Labour Party is inevitable. Even if I'm not there, even if you're not there, it doesn't matter. And even if all of the present lefts in the Facebook bubble, even if they're excluded, it doesn't matter. That surge into the Labour Party will completely change the whole outlook of the party as a whole. It depends what you think we are doing. I don't think the left, and the Marxist left certainly, will ever capture the bureaucracy of the Labour Party, and probably not a majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party. That's looking into the far distant future. I don't know exactly how things will turn out. What I'm setting my sights on at the moment, I'm being modest, is developing large currents of opinion, of genuine opinion inside the Labour Party, let's say numbering thousands, let's say numbering, large numbers like that, which base themselves on genuine socialist ideas. I was interested in what you said, Mike, about the objective character of the Labour Party, because I think you're dead right. The Labour Party has always been bipolar. It's always had this split personality. The tops of the Labour Party, or many of them, most of them nowadays, always look towards reforming capitalism, managing capitalism better than the Tories do. That's always been their outlook. But the ranks of the Labour Party have always reflected the aspirations of millions of workers. It reflects those aspirations today, and it will in the next general election. Now, that split between the top and the bottom means there's always a potential for actual splits taking place. In periods of relative political calm, then these two wings of the party muddle along together. But in periods of economic crisis, they will split. They split in 1931. They split in 1982. And I think they will split again. We've already had a lot of mini splits where right-wingers have split away, where one or two left-wingers have split away. I think we will have big splits again in the future because of the pressure of the economic crisis. And lastly, on your question, Tina, I didn't deal with it because I didn't have time, but I agree absolutely. The unions are key. One of the notable standout features of this conference was the relative quietness, the relative dormancy of Unite. Now, Sharon Graham is playing a very, very good role in industrial disputes. But on the issue of the Labour Party, I think she's making a serious mistake, standing aside from the Labour Party, not intervening. Glenn McCluskey in the past was always one of the big speakers at conference, and it influenced delegates. The absence of a Unite impact on this conference was very, very significant. The standout speaker was actually the General Secretary, in my opinion, of the CWU. I thought he was the best speaker at conference. And of course, his is one of the relatively small unions. But the pressure you mentioned, Tina, that will be on those Labour leaders, on those trade union leaders, will also come from the rank and file. I think it's inevitable. There are kind of murmurs of that now. The reason why Christina McAnear made a very radical speech at conference is because she's got members who are at the end of their tether, absolutely at the end of the tether. The same is true, we know, among Unite members, among GMB members and USDO members. And that pressure on those union leaders will produce some surprises as well in the future.
Thank you, John. If you have time, it'd be great if you could hang around and perhaps we can answer some question of the audience as they come in. First up with a hand up was Marion. I think your camera doesn't work. Is that right? That's why.
I'm having problems with the camera at the moment, but I think this is a very important debate. And I agree, a lot of people fail to understand the dual character of the Labour Party. The base made up of the trade union is different to the bourgeois part of the Labour Party, the leadership. But the key thing is, I think, is the trade union. I've been a member of the CWU for 30 odd years. And we've had many, many debates on whether we should be affiliated or not. And I've always argued we should remain affiliated until such time that the trade unions decide that they want to leave and set up a proper working class party on a socialist programme. The other thing that nobody's really mentioned is what kind of demands do we want to place on the Labour leadership. I mean, I can remember a number of slogans from the past: Labour to power on a socialist programme. Nobody's mentioning that side of things. How do we win the hearts and minds of ordinary people to start wanting more political control and more control over their lives? And how do we fight for a socialist alternative? We should be bringing some of that in as well. Now, I think it's premature at this stage, until we've won the battle in the trade union movement, to set up an alternative. Now, some in the comments have said that's not possible. Well, I believe it is. I believe it is, because a lot of members, if we've got to have that fight for democracy within our own unions as well. And I know Dave Ward has been wanting an alternative for workers that he's been pushing at the TUC for many a year. And he's been quite instrumental in doing Enough is Enough. And he's quite, on a lot of levels, he's a genuine kind of person. But we have to have that fight out for democracy. And if that's key. So it's easy to be pessimistic and say, well, you know, Starmer and Evans ain't going to let us in. Well, some people are already in there. And if we use the influence in our trade unions, we can have maybe an influence. But we also should be preparing outside. Enough is enough. We need to be having mass demonstrations against war, against the Third World War, fighting to end poverty in this country. Poverty is on a mass scale in this country now. You know, you've got people that can't afford to eat their homes or put food on their table. You've got people working 40 hours a week and can't have enough money for food. You've got students now that they're saying now, after they've paid their rent and expenses, they've got £50 a month to live on. Now, that's the level of stuff in this country. There's enough for us to be organising around. But I think we need to sort of think more like the twin track strategy that Summers has had in the past. We need to be working inside the Labour Party, but also outside the Labour Party. We need to be going where people are organising and taking part in the fight back. And there's a lot of people that want radical change now. They've had enough of it. They've had enough of this war. And they're not prepared to pay the price for Ukraine in not having enough to eat and being able to eat. A lot of ordinary people ain't prepared to do that. It's all right for these rich people that has no income on to say that. They're not the one paying the price. It's people like me and people like you. So the key thing is we have to look at how are we going to do things. It's easy to say, be ultra left, to say, I'll just forget the Labour Party. There's been a lot of it. There's been a lot of that in the past and it's failed. It's failed because it hasn't been serious enough and it hasn't won the battle in the trade unions. If that's what we want to do, we need to be all organising and agitating within the trade union properly to do it. It's too easy for people to say that. You know, we've got to be prepared to get our hands dirty inside the Labour Party and outside. Some of us are able to play more of a role in the Labour Party than others. But until such time as disaffiliation takes place, I think we've got to be in there as well.
Thank you, Marion. And as we discussed, the disaffiliation, that pressure is probably off at the moment because a lot of these trade union bureaucrats, and that's what they are, they smell, there's a Labour government coming. So, I might get some of my demands through, if we hang around the Labour Party, there is that pressure, which leads, of course, to the need to democratize the union movement as well. But I quite agree with your twin approach. I'm going to bring in Roger Silverman now. Hello, comrade, because I know you have quite a different viewpoint. So let's hear it.
Yes, I do. And I know exactly where John is coming from. I mean, we both had the same training over several decades in militants. And the trouble is, let me say that I've moved on from the perspectives that we had in 1964 when the first issue of Militant came out. So the idea was Labour is the party of the working class, so we have to stay in it. And that was absolutely right. It was right for a long time. But I'm afraid that I think that John is taking an undialectical and a anti-historical viewpoint on the Labour Party. The Labour Party has changed absolutely. It's had a complete transformation. The Labour Party, of course, was founded as the party of the working class, as the political expression of the trade unions. The key, or the clue, is in the name. It was the party of Labour. And it remained a party, a working class party. Not only that, it became in 1918 a socialist party. It adopted Clause 4 and it clung on to that against attacks from the right wing for 3/4 of a century. And Clause 4 mattered. Clause 4 said that we stand for a socialist society. And when Hugh Gaitskell, who was a kind of precursor of Blair, tried to remove it in 1959, he was absolutely crushed by the overwhelming surge of resistance from the rank and file. Now, the Labour Party, a party of the working class, but it always, as the anthem said, it always had cowards and traitors. Cowards flinch and traitors sneer. And if you like, the right wing were always the traitors, and unfortunately, the official left were always the cowards who never really challenged them. But that underwent a complete change in 1994 when Blair became leader of the Labour Party. Now, many people say Clause 4, just a scrap of paper. Well, Tony Blair didn't think it was a scrap of paper. The very first act of Tony Blair on assuming the leadership within a matter of weeks. He called a special conference in order to delete clause 4. And why did he do that? Because it was a testament, it was a guarantee to the ruling class. I promise you, we're no longer even going to pretend to be in favor of a new society or for socialism or to be anti-capitalism. Peter Mandelson said, I'm intensely relaxed about people becoming filthy rich. And it wasn't just...
Sorry, Roger, can I hurry you a little bit along? What are you suggesting instead? Because we're sort of...
Well, let me give me a little bit longer, please, if I can just make my point.
Couple minutes, though.
Well, all right. I mean, I would have liked to go longer. Maybe you
do.
could have another session sometime where I could expand a bit more on that.
Right.
But look, what I'm saying now is it's no longer a party of the working class. It's two parties. The leadership of the Labour Party and the parliamentary party of the bureaucracy, they're not reformists. They are capitalists. They're actually going to be more efficient managers of capitalism than this mad regime that we've got at the present time. We've got a government which is no less reactionary than that of Italy or Sweden or Hungary. It's an extreme right-wing government. What we need is, above all, with the huge movement that is going on of strikes and of protests, what we need is a conference of all labour organisations, of trade unions, trades councils, community organisations, just to form a party, to form a mass party of the working class to fight for socialism. Yes, Labour will win, but it won't be a Labour Party. It will be another Tory government, and it's not the same as the Wilson governments and so on. I'll say more maybe on another occasion.
Graham, do you want to ask Roger something?
Yeah, I'd like to ask one question, Roger. If the party changed its class character in 1994, when it deleted the old clause 4, how do you explain Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader 30 years later, 25 years later, or 20 years later? Doesn't make any sense to me. And I think that I'd ask you and others as well. And surely we still define the party by its objective character and its relationship with the trade union movement, and not just what is in the constitution, important as that is. But the key thing is, I don't accept that it changed its character in 1994 because of what I call a piece of paper. No, you can't explain Jeremy otherwise.
Short answer, Roger, if you can.
Okay, you didn't listen to my answer if you asked me that before. I never said that it was a bourgeois party. I said it's two parties. We have a party of the bureaucracy and of the parliamentary party, which is not reformist. It's a capitalist, pure capitalist party. And you've got the base, which is a working class, and it is splitting. The Labour Party is splitting, and it's long overdue. And I could give a lot of examples, but I don't think Tina will let me.
Briefly, though, on your proposal for a conference, what kind of program, what kind of, where do you get the people for that organization?
Well, what I'm saying is, you see, the idea of Arthur Scargill and Chris Williamson and George Galloway and so on is I think mistaken, because the Labour movement doesn't create parties by somebody coming up and saying, I'm your leader, and then advertising for a rank and file. We need to have something organic coming from the labour organisations themselves, the trade unions and so on, and they will decide their policies and they will elect their leaders. And so the way it will happen, I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but I think that is what we should be pushing for. And it is taking place. It is a split. The right wing, it's a one-sided split, which is being pursued with absolutely bitter hatred by the leadership of the Labour Party. It's an absolute purge. Again, I can give examples, but I don't think it's necessary.
Anybody got another question to Roger, or can we bring in the next person? I think we bring in Nick Rack now. Everybody's going to be able to speak. Just going to ask people in different order. Thank you. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Comrade Chair, Tina. Thank you very much. Thank you to John for introducing the discussion. Thanks to Roger for putting his position. It seems like we're trying to rehearse history. We've had 3 people who were brought up in the militant tendency. I'm the 3rd. I was also an editor of The Militant. And I don't want to go through an old faction fight, but if I'm forced to say it, I've changed my position. I'm much, much closer to John Pickard than I am to Roger Silverman. And the reason for that is my experiences over the last 25 years have shown me that there's a lot of sense and correctness in what John Pickard said, although I do have some differences, which if I have the time, I'll explain. And I don't agree with the proposal that Roger is setting out, and I'll try to explain why. First of all, I've got my own considerable experience of trying to participate and build socialist alternatives to the left. We had the Socialist Alliance, which I thought was the most successful. We had Respect, which I thought was a disaster. And we had Left Unity, which amounted to nothing. And
I think I've got it right, but I can't see myself there. Right now.
one of the main reasons for the failure.
I've spoken. You can watch me later if you want.
Sorry, somebody is.
Can we mute while I'm
Yes,
speaking?
I've muted everybody now. Sorry, comrade.
So the reason that they failed is precisely because they're attempted to do what Roger is suggesting, and that is putting the cart before the horse. And what Roger's suggesting in terms of a new proposal for a conference of labour organisations and individuals and so on, and that will somehow come up with the right programme, I think is fundamentally mistaken. The problem that we have in the British labour movement and internationally, in my opinion, is the weakness of Marxism, the weakness of an analysis from a revolutionary socialist perspective, and a lack of confidence and boldness amongst even those who say that they are Marxists in arguing for an alternative form of society based on the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. I rejoined the Labour Party under Corbyn, although I was only able to play 1 year's membership because I was expelled for 2 years and then suspended for another, and I'm still suspended at the moment. But what is it? First of all, can I just say I completely understand and sympathise with the 200,000 people that have gone. Those 200,000 people put an enormous amount of effort, like I did and like others, in trying to build support for Jeremy Corbyn and trying to build support for socialist policies within that. I had my criticisms of Jeremy Corbyn. I thought his programme was weak social democracy. But the main problem that we had and still have in the Labour Party is there's no clear agreement about what we mean even by socialism. I saw in the chat, and it's not a criticism, but one of the comrade Victor, I think, he said that Starmer's not a true socialist like Attlee. Well, for me, Attlee wasn't a true socialist. He might have presided over the most left-wing Labour government, but he had the opportunity to rely on the working class in Britain to change society fundamentally, and he didn't do it. Why? And this goes back to the origins of the Labour Party, and this is where I disagree with Roger. The Labour Party has never, in my opinion, been a socialist party. It's always been a bourgeois workers' party. That is, a capitalist workers' party. That is, that a membership represented the working class and an inchoate consciousness about the need for change, whilst the leadership and the programme, even with Clause 4, the programme was for the continuation of capitalism. And Tony Blair said the worst thing we ever did was split with liberalism, but in fact, liberalism came and continued throughout the period of the Labour Party, and it continues today, and it shifts one way and then the other. So for me, the most important thing is actually not in or out of the Labour Party, although I don't see the point, and I would argue and urge comrades not to take that step out. The main point is trying to build the arguments for fundamental socialist change. And that means having the argument inside the Labour Party, difficult as that might be now, to persuade, let's call it 100,000. How many people joined under Jeremy Corbyn? 300,000? How many people left? 200,000. That leaves, on simple arithmetic, still 100,000 people that joined looking for change, plus all those that were still in, plus those that have working class experience, which drives them to confront capitalism and look for answers. If I've got a criticism of myself and other Marxists who joined the Labour Party who were already in there, is that we did not do enough to explain and to articulate how Marxism charts a way forward. We allowed the education of socialist ideas to be dominated by a middle class, petty bourgeois circle in momentum. And the ideas of socialism that we got were completely mixed, inadequate, incomplete.
Yep.
And so what we need, in my opinion, is Marxists in and out of the Labour Party to get together, to organise, to propagandise for a different form of society, a fundamental change in society. And we can't expect workers, the majority of workers, and this is perhaps where I have a slight difference with John, it seemed a bit too passive for me. I don't think it's enough to say that workers will come to the conclusion when they go through the experience, because really we're just asking them to form ideas. What we lack is a party so that we have a memory, a way of educating and taking those ideas to the class and assisting them in that process of drawing conclusions. And that's our task. That's what we need to do. And therefore, I appeal to other Marxists in this meeting. Somehow we need to come together and form a way to propagandize, to educate, and not to go off into half-baked, what will be simply semi-warmed up, lukewarm versions of the Corbyn project, but outside of the mass movement.
Yeah, you've made your points very well, Nick. Thank you very much. Mike, did you want to ask him a question? Oh, sorry.
I was going to wait, Tina, until comrades have come in.
Okay, let's bring some other comrades in. Thanks very much for joining us, Nick. And it is something I'm very interested as well in discussing, and we should discuss with you and other comrades in the future. Jane, sorry to keep you waiting.
Can you hear me?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, hi. I very much agree with the last guy, but I wish he could have done it in a few sentences. See me, I'm in social housing with the elderly. Now, Tina, I thought that was like the mantra of neoliberalism. There is no alternative. So very much so. I pay me $5 a month. They haven't sussed me yet. But, you know, we haven't done the basics. We aren't where we were in historical industrial age of capitalism and the workers' unions. There's tons of us outside of unions that need to be brought in and educated about Marxism. And what is Marxism now? Who is the working class you're talking about? Where does capitalism fit in? And we're now on Hayekian and Friedman steroids with global corporate, you know, running around regime shopping. And people here, they're all going for independence. I'm in Muirhouse in Edinburgh, and you know, you're not reaching the connection of, if you're not in the union, yes, you have a lever into the means of production. You can impact on a capitalist economy. But when we're in the Labour Party and we talk about redistribution within a global capitalist economy, how does that work? How does democratic socialism, what is the political economy aligned to that? Because my understanding was that Bernstein's revisionist democratic socialism was left nameless on the floor in 1904 by Rosa in the Reichstag. So maybe that was right decision at that time. What is the democratic socialism now that relates to those of us who don't come through the union history, who are out there, who are we working class? What the hell are we? You know, we're all over the place. It's not the same as it was 40 years ago in 68 when we had hope. things have changed. And how do we redefine Marxism now in a current way? I know I haven't said that very intelligently, but, you know, I'm very frustrated. I stay in the party, but we're not doing the education, because I'm out there in the street and they're not getting it, the connection between the economy and their human rights. You know, we got rampant subjectivity all over the shop. So I don't know. That's me. Sorry.
Thanks, Jane. I mean, it's really important. Yes, we have to rediscover Marxism, quite right. And what is the working class? What is socialism? I think there's lots of different ideas about it. But I would really like to go back to Marx and have a look at what he actually said, and Engels as well. And the Labour Left Alliance every Thursday, for example, has an education series about socialists in our history. And that's been, I think, very eye-opening. So I'd welcome comrades to come along to that. Thanks, Jane. Steve, actually, no, sorry. Dave Hill hasn't spoken in our shows ever. Sorry, Steve Freeman, you will be heard. Don't worry. But I'm going to take some people who haven't been speaking in our shows recently. Thank you. Hi, Dave.
Hi. Thank you, comrades. There's immense anger, isn't there? And I'm going to use a technical phrase, but I think the material conditions of people's existence, in other words, their everyday immiseration, pauperization, is leading them to demand major changes. Now, we have to be there, so the right-wing populism doesn't take those people on board. I think I worked with Nick Rack about 10 years ago, a decade ago, in the Independent Socialist Network. We worked very harmoniously, but no more, because I think what Nick said was, to a large extent, supporting and unknowingly supporting my argument and Roger Silverman's argument that there is no point at all in staying within the Labour Party. The capitalist class and the Labour leadership got such a fright with Corbyn that never in the history of the Labour Party, never, ever, ever has the party expelled ideas and people from the party. Never have they done so much to make sure that socialism never rears its head. And so I've posted something quite wordy in the chat, and I think our task, comrades, is to build a socialist working class party from Enough is Enough, Don't Pay UK. I've got my criticisms. I'm involved in both. I've got my criticisms of both. From the various left little sects with their hundreds, or in some cases 1,000 or 2,000 members, and with the 200,000 people who have left the Labour Party. So, and also retained links with those inside the Labour Party, a dual track moment. I've also not mentioned the trade unions, and people haven't dismissed the trade unions, but of course there are many active socialists in every branch of every of many branches of trade unions up and down the country. What I'm saying is there is a huge constituency. There's a huge constituency of people not only willing to accept, but already accepting aspects of Marxist and socialist analysis and program. We can look, for example, at Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion, hugely depoliticized, but not all of them. And it's our job to actually politicize them. Now, I'm not suggesting that we set up a mass, try and set up a mass party. I think Roger's idea is a very good idea. And I think the word organic is what differentiates us Marxists now from Marxists of perhaps debates of about 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, in that now there is so much more emphasis on looking at what's going round in every town, groups springing up, and looking at not imposing a doctrine, not imposing a program, suggesting, of course, but as I think it was Roger said, some of the demands will arise. We cannot be foreign to the revolutionary and pre-revolutionary comrades in this country. And I think we have to also, in our little groups, such as Socialist Labour Network or whatever group comrades belong to, maintain our Marxism and not dissolve ourselves into broad parties which often, in fact, always, where they got into power, carried out neoliberal policies. Berlin, Portugal, lots of different countries. And I'll end up by saying that there are 3 areas that we as Marxists need to operate in. The first one is direct action. The last time I was in Greece, I'm active in Greek politics to a small extent, I took part in an occupation of a hospital to get a comrade his job back. And it worked. He's now just recently got a job. He was dismissed for COVID-related, criticising the management for not being careful enough with COVID precautions. So direct action, and I include in that direct action against the capitalist media. And I think we have to inhibit, I won't use the word stop, although didn't they go bananas when the press was closed down for 3 hours recently? Imagine if it was closed down for 3 months. So direct action. Second, electoralism. I fought 13 elections. Very useful to propagandize and also to carry out some policies. And finally, I think this relates partly to what Roger said. I've phrased it in terms of local councils of action, bringing together tenants associations, trade unionists, individual comrades. So local councils of action, direct action, and electoralism. And concluding a couple of words, ending up with a national conference of all those progressive, socialist, Marxist, revolutionary, anti-capitalist people and groups that want to attend.
Sounds good, doesn't it? Does anybody, Graham, Mike, do you want to ask a question of Dave?
Listen, I've got a few things to add to the conversation.
Keep it short, Mike, please. We've got
Sure.
lots of people.
I'll wait until, if you don't mind, Tina, maybe.
Okay, then keep your hand down because I keep thinking you want to ask a question of the speaker. Okay, Becky hasn't spoken in our meeting, so I'm gonna bring you in next. Hi, Becky.
Hi, Tina. Thank you. Yeah, I've been listening really carefully to the discussion this evening, and in a way, I don't want to give a response, you know, with lots of political terminology in it. I want to say what I feel, and what I feel at the moment is we have a duty to oppose Labour, because Starmer's Labour Party, for those of you that have watched the Labour files, they're busy with surveillance, they're busy with hacking, they're busy with lying MPs, they're busy with fixing, and they are a very dirty bunch of people. And to add to that, imagine what Starmer would be like as Prime Minister. Liz Truss is saying, oh, I'll move the embassy to Jerusalem. I actually don't think Liz Truss will. Starmer would. Starmer is tweeting tonight about how we're going to stand alongside Ukraine forever. Presumably, he means keep sending lots of bombs. Starmer, in my opinion, not only will he not go on a picket line, I think that he will bring in legislation beyond the Tory streams, as Blair did, bizarrely, brought in legislation beyond Margaret Thatcher's streams to crush the working class. That's my opinion, you know, and that's how I feel about Starmer, and that's how I feel about Labour. So for me, my activity over the next couple of years is going to be working in my own local community in Hove, with a group of other people who they would call themselves socialists, and do exactly what Dave alluded to, like setting up with other groups like Acorn and people who are active in my local community, and actually do the campaigning work and do the policy work. But it won't be for Labour, it'll be helping and politicising, hopefully, at the same time.
What do you think about a new party then of the left?
I kind of feel it's going to be inevitable, because Labour was to say, in my opinion, it's a dead duck anyway, but I think it's worse than a dead duck. It's like a poisoned dead duck, still kicking around. I think when Labour take power, which looks likely at the moment, they're going to be a massive disappointment to anybody that ever thought they would do anything helpful. And I just think there will be some organic resistance now. It's becoming untenable. It's the most untenable I have seen in 7 decades. Well, not that my first decade, I was conscious of politics, so leaving that aside. Yeah, I've never seen anything like this in my life. Never. I've never seen media silence like this. Nothing. We're in a bad way.
We certainly are. I guess the question is then what kind of program as well. I think that's where some comrades disagree, although, you know, there's other disagreements on that issue. Thanks, Becky. Steve Freeman, then you've been waiting a while. Sorry.
I'm trying to unmute myself. Thank you, Tina. And you came up with a key line just at the very end there. I mean, the program is the key to all of this. If we don't have a program, then we cannot have a party. We can have lots of activity. We can run around like headless chickens. We can do this, that, and the next thing. But if we don't have a program, then we cannot build a party. That's an essential idea. And so what we need to be thinking about is not organizational things about organizing this and that, but what is the program that we need to stand on? I mean, Becca just said Labour's a dead duck. I think the House of Commons, by the way, is a dead duck. And I can hear a heck of a lot of quacking going on there. And I think, why is that not in our sights? Why do we not think there's something seriously wrong in the way the parliamentary system works that we're meant to operate in? So if I go back to the original question, is the Labour Party dead? I agree with John. No. Will it win the next election with millions of votes? Quite likely, it looks like to me. I think he's right to say that. Is it dead for revival for Jeremy Corbyn? I think the answer to that has got to be yes. And the programme that Corbyn stood on, trying to revive the 1945 social monarchy in the 2017-2019 programme, that's dead as a dormouse or a duck. I don't know what kind of thing it's dead as, but it seems to me it's dead. So I want to ask some different questions, really, that need answering. Is the Labour Party in a terminal crisis? So it could still be alive, but it could still be in a terminal crisis. And some parties have terminal crises, like the Liberal Party had, like the Italian Christian Democrats had, like the Italian Communist Party had, for example. Is it in a terminal crisis? Doesn't mean we should leave it, by the way. I mean, it's not that they do. Always in terminal crisis, we better run away. It doesn't mean anything like that. Is it dead for democracy? Is there ever going to be any democracy in the Labour Party? Can that be revived? Is it dead for republicanism? I'm wondering to myself, obviously, because when you see them singing God Save the King, what is the Labour Party? Is there a terminal crisis of the British Union? Is there a terminal crisis of our constitution going on? So what is the epoch that we're in? And that's where I start to disagree with John, really, because John refers to 1931. Then we had the British Empire. That was before the Second World War. That was before we had the 1945 social monarchy. So all of those things are quite different. And we are in a much deeper crisis, a terminal crisis of our whole political system. And I think that has to be taken into account in any program that we have. Our constitution and political system has been broken by 30 years of neoliberalism. It's been broken by the financial crisis of 2008, and it's been broken by a decade of austerity, and it's been broken by Brexit. Brexit is a real breach in the constitution when Northern Ireland wants to go, when Northern Ireland and Scotland vote to remain and England and Wales vote to remain. That's a serious fracture in our system. So I think we've got to look at how the political system actually operates, because at the end of the day, the constitution is the mechanism by which the City of London runs and rules over the working class. So we have got to look at all of this. I'll come to an end, Tina, by saying this. If it's 1931 we're looking at, which John mentioned, it's more like 1931 in Spain rather than 1931 in Britain, because in 1931 in Spain, the system began to break down and it began to polarize between republicanism on one hand and fascism on the other. And I think we can see the seeds of that type of situation to take into account. We've seen the rise of authoritarianism, and I'll finish on this point, Tina, rise of authoritarianism on the right. And the optimistic thing I would say is the Labour Party conference voting for PR, because although the PR is not the solution, it shows us a section of the Labour movement that's looking for a democratic alternative direction. And I think that's something we have to take into account.
I think that was the unions changing their view on it.
Yes, yes, it was.
Sections have always supported PR.
Yes, no, I agree, but there's a movement going on there where people are thinking there's something wrong with our democracy and they're looking for an answer to it. I mean, that's what's happening.
I agree. I mean, the problem is Starmer will ignore it, and he already said he will ignore it because that's not...
Of course.
There's no pressure on him at the moment, or that it's not wanted. Although it does, obviously, it for the left, I think it would be a huge step forward. It would go some way to unshackle the working class from the Labour Party if we can actually have an electoral platform that a left alternative could contest.
I quite agree, Tina, and it goes back to the point at the very beginning, the thing that you said when I came in, i.e. its programme. Should PR be in our programme, for example? Should the House of Commons be in our programme, and so on and so forth? That's where we have to start thinking along those lines.
Abolition of the monarchy in the House of Lords was, of course, in the Labour Party programme a long time ago, and they kind of took it out. Thanks, Steve. Okay, we've got Norman Thomas now. Hi.
Hi, Tina. Thanks. It's a really good. Sorry, of the mysterious messages on the screen. It's a great debate. Becky said two interesting things. She talked about the Al Jazeera films, which probably said about as much terrible stuff about the Labour Party as it could within the 3-part TV series or the 4-part YouTube series as you possibly could. But she also mentioned media silence, and that's what there's been, media silence, deafening media silence. So despite all that Al Jazeera did, it's been blotted out by the mainstream media. And so that's what brings me to what I think is one of the key elements that has been missed out of our discussion so far, which is the media and how we actually, it's no point in us shouting about how bad the Labour Party is, because nobody is listening except the people who are already in the circle, in our circle. Nobody's listening. I think a lot of the outside public don't really care anyway. There's a huge cynicism about politics. People just think they're all the same. And certainly in South Wales, where I come from, they think that all politicians are the same. They're waiting for something different. Jeremy seemed to be something different. He therefore attracted a lot of new people to his side, a lot of young people who aren't on this call, and we can't get to come to these calls, but lots and lots of new people. When I first came to London in 1979, Tony Benn was talking about the need for a newspaper of the left. I went and saw him. I was a young journalist, and I had plans with people to start a new magazine, and he was incredibly receptive because he knew that the key to change is to have access to the media. There were various attempts to set up newspapers. They all failed. But I think this program here, Red Line TV, and some of the others that are starting up, hold the key to the future. We need to spend more time in building up an alternative media. We need to have more of these kind of Zoom programs and other experiments with the media in order to reach out to other people, to younger people, to people all over the country who will be involved both in activism, because I think activism is hugely important, but also in the media. We need to spread the ideas that we've got via the media. We need to put more effort into that, less effort just endlessly debating with a diminishing number of people about how bad things are, and more trying to reach out to new people using the new technology that we've got to hand. And it is new. This didn't exist when Tony Benn and I talked in 1979. It does now. He wanted the new media to exist. He was hoping that maybe things like local radio and other new things would help. But we've got this now. We need to build on it. We need to have more red line TVs. We need to have red line TV much more expanded. We need to get our word out to people. I want more people to think about that and to join in trying to spread a new network across the country, joining up local activists on a national scale. Thanks.
That's it. Think about Redline more, comrades, and maybe support us financially if you can. Maybe Mike, you could put the link to Patreon in the chat. That'd be fantastic. Hi, Paul.
Hello. Yeah, my point is that I mean, to go back to the question of is Labour dead? To me, that was the wrong premise in the first place. It's not that Labour's dead. It isn't. The point is, it's dead as a progressive force for the working class. So the question is around that. It was never whether about Labour was dead. Of course it isn't. I agree with most of what, without going into the history of it, of what Roger said, although, Roger, Dave and Becky. In fact, I like Becky's bit the most because it actually, no offense to anyone else, but it actually offered a degree of optimism because a lot of the discussion around this so far has been on about it won't work, it never has happened, worked in the past and all that sort of stuff. You're not going to give people much hope if you go along that line all the time. And the only reason I think organisations like Left Unity failed in the end was because they actually joined the Labour Party. They all came along and joined Corbyn's Labour Party. No, I think, I mean, you know, as I say, I agree with Roger. Split's already happening. And like Becky said, you know, I think, like he says, there will be sort of an organic movement that will build up and something will bring from that. Solidarity to Becky, because obviously she was one of those featured in the Al Jazeera film. And the other thing, all this talk about how you must get behind the Labour Party, have they not seen the Al Jazeera files? Come on, how could anyone on the left seriously advocating voting for the Labour Party after all of this? So I get rather frustrated by the negativity that comes from people that keep clinging on to the Labour Party. They're quite frankly, although it's not their intention, they're effectively preventing any progress from being made elsewhere. Sorry on that negative note, but that's my view. Thanks.
That gives a lot of power to people like John and Graham, which I don't think they actually stop anything like that, you know, anything else developing. It's just, I think it's a reflection of the class struggle that there's nothing serious developing actually, and I think a bit of realism. I think Marion put it as the first contribution quite well. You know, a twin approach is what is needed, and I think that is still correct. And we have one more speaker from the floor, and then we're going to sum up. That's Victor.
Good evening, Tina. Lovely to see you. I couldn't believe my ears this evening. I actually heard people who call themselves socialists and Marxists suggest that they're going to campaign and support Blairite war criminals, Blairites who want to sell off our hospitals under PFI. They're going to support Islamophobia policies. They're going to support more war crimes. They're going to accept the leadership of a man who was Tony Blair's Director of Public Prosecutions. No wonder people in this is how the socialists are behaving. Have we no shame? Have we no credibility? Do we not know that Keir Starmer has branded most of us as anti-Semites? And you can seriously suggest kissing his backside and supporting him? I think it's fair now to compare Keir Starmer with Adolf Hitler. Hitler came to power with only a third of the Reichstag supporting him. He had heavies that stopped people from voting if they weren't his supporters. At the last two Labour Party conferences, people who didn't support Starmer suddenly found they weren't allowed in because Starmer had heavies who told them they were expelled for being anti-Semites. Like the people who didn't want Hitler to be elected dictator, they didn't know they were going to be barred.
Are you finished? Okay, I think we get the drift. I think his internet stopped. I think it's a bit much, perhaps, comparing Starmer to Hitler. But let's leave that there. Thank you everybody for contributing to that discussion. It is an ongoing discussion, and we have different views on it. And I think what we're trying to show with the red lines as well, I have quite different views from Graham and from Mike and from John, is that we can discuss these things in a calm and comradely way. And I think from my perspective, it seems pretty clear, as long as the unions remain affiliated to the Labour Party and the pressure on them to stay affiliated will become stronger now with the prospect of a Labour government. And as long as there is a first past the post electoral system, it seems quite clear that we have to have a strategy, at least towards the Labour Party, and a twin approach, as Marion outlined, and stay in if you can and can stomach it and if you haven't been expelled, but also cohere our forces on the outside. And that's probably actually where the more interesting debate will have to happen in the near future. And I very much like what Nick Rack was saying on the need to actually fight for our Marxist program and not just say, yeah, this enough is fantastic, and we're going to, go to those and try and lure them into some kind of new workers' party, etc. That's a sort of social democratic party. No, I think we know as Marxists what needs to be done and what kind of program we should fight for. And we have to actively engage, of course, with comrades who are coming into politics, but on the basis that we're socialists and not, economists, or not, we have a program, have a vision for socialism. We should always fight for that, in my view. Graham, go on.
Well, firstly, comrades, let's be careful with the way we formulate words and not equate Starmer with Hitler. I mean, come on, this has got to be a serious debate, and that's actually not serious. But look, I want to leave most of my time to John, but I just want to make just a few points. One, time is running out because the elephant in the room is the climate crisis. And I've always used to say for years and years, our task is to lay down traditions for future generations. Well, the danger is there won't be future generations unless we make some decisive changes. Now, I agree a lot with what Nick said about the need to, for a clear Marxist program. I'm probably one of the few people here who, by the way, wasn't in the militant. For the record, comrades, I was in the left opposition to the militant in the early 70s, it's always been absolutely critical for my politics to try to speak truth to power. But let's understand the way this works. In my opinion, it isn't just a question of the strength of our ideas, important as that is. It's the building the conditions that those ideas can become relevant. And I think it's quite clear, it always was the case, that the prime orientation is to rebuild class struggle resistance. Even in the Corbyn years, that was the critical time when there was room for real work in the Labour Party. More so now than ever. Everything will depend on building the resistance so that come a Starmer government, we don't just talk about stopping Starmer and smashing Starmer, but we actually build the material forces that can do that, and the material forces that can enable our revolutionary ideas to become relevant rather than just a sideshow. So that's where I think we fight to build the resistance, fight for a political expression as well, because you can't just stay in the streets. What starts in the streets and in the trade unions has to find a political expression within the party to the extent that we can, but outside, as I suspect will happen if we must. And I think we now have got to build that resistance for the time when a Starmer government, because it represents the bourgeoisie, and I totally accept that, by the way, it's the bourgeois wing of the Labour Party, when that attacks the trade union movement, the resistance, then that is the critical moment, or it could be. But there isn't all the time in the world, comrades. There's no time now for just laying down traditions. Time's running out, and I share comrades' impatience.
Thanks, Graham. John.
Well, thanks, comrades, for the invitation of the meeting, and I thank comrades who participated in the meeting. I can't possibly answer or comment on all of those who've spoken. But one of the interesting words that I think it was Steve used was, one of the interesting questions he used was, what epoch are we in? And I think it's important to make the point, it's kind of an overarching point, that we live in unprecedented times. I've been politically active since I joined the Young Socialists for well over 50 years, approaching 55 years. And things are happening in politics, in economics, that never happened at any previous time in my lifetime. Every single political party will be broken in this. Everyone, the Tory party and the Labour Party as well. Although that's not necessarily something that's going to happen in the next year or 2 years, but in due course it will happen. I mentioned the government of 1931 in the context of a Labour government, but Steve mentioned 1931 in Spain, and I think that's a perfectly good analogy, insofar as we can learn lessons from history, which is difficult when everything's unprecedented. Insofar as we can learn those lessons, 1931 is worth looking at because it was the beginning of effectively civil war and revolution in that country. Now, in relation to a comment that Marion raised, Left Horizons does work as an active political tendency. We are active, we're not passive in that sense. And we do put forward a political programme for a £15 an hour minimum wage, for a rent freeze, for the cancellation of all the private contracts in the health service, for the cancellation of PFI in the health service, for the insourcing of local authority, for the nationalisation of utilities. A lot of these policies, which are already very popular, according to opinion polls, and will be more popular again in the future. But I do agree with what the comrades have said, that we've got to kind of constantly argue and put forward the, if you like, the justification for socialism. Even if we're fighting against the stream, we've got to continue to do that, because it's us doing that, combined with the experiences that workers go through, that will actually make a difference in the long run. Now, I disagree with Roger Roger and I go back a long way. I have a huge respect for Roger. Whenever Roger writes anything, my first thought was, oh, I wish I could write like that. But having said that, I don't agree with him. The idea that somehow the Labour Party qualitatively changed in 1994 is wrong. Tony Blair was sending a signal to Rupert Murdoch. He wasn't changing the balance of forces within society and the social weight of the working class. He wasn't producing anything fundamental in that sense. If there had been a fundamental change in the Labour Party in 1994, qualitative change, as Roger implies, well, as Graham said, Corbynism would not have happened. Roger himself would not have rejoined the Labour Party in 2015. The idea that the Labour Party is two parties is not new. I said that myself in the introduction. Although this idea that Roger has, that the Labour Party is going through a slow motion split, well, I don't know how slow the slow motion is. In historic terms, of course it's happening. And the idea of a one-sided split, I don't get. A split has to be two-sided, but it's not a split at all. The fact of the matter is that the expulsions that are taking place, the dead hand of the bureaucracy, even the Al Jazeera investigations program will not affect tens of millions of workers. It will not affect them. It will not have any impact on them. Even us in this meeting, we're in a bubble. All of us, we're in a bubble. We represent a tiny sliver of opinion across, if you like, on the surface of a mass of a class. We're looking at big movements. We're looking at class movements, things that are outside of our control. The idea of building a new party that Dave mentioned, it ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen in the foreseeable future. And when there is an election, millions upon millions of people will be voting Labour, and I will be urging them to vote Labour. I would have urged them to vote Labour in 1945, even though we had Labour ministers locking up workers who were going on strike during the war, even though we had Labour ministers who were opposed to Indian independence and lots of other things. I was still in favour of a Labour government, or I would have been if I'd been politically active in 1945. The perspective we have isn't that the Labour Party is going to change kind of magically, that the Parliamentary Labour Party is going to see the light, or that the bureaucracy of the Labour Party is going to change. The perspective that we have is for what will happen in the roots of the Labour Party, which represents the aspirations of millions of workers, and that still is the truth. That still is the case. We can't get away from that. We can't avoid that, and we can't jump over that.
Agree quite a lot with you, what you're saying, apart from the fact that the programs you mentioned were quite minimum demands there. And I think as Marxists, I think we should always put also the...
I could have spoken a bit longer on that. But...
All right. Oh, it gets better the longer you go on. Good. Mike, would you like to sum up a bit?
Thanks, Tina. Yeah, I mean, listen, I share everyone's frustration. I share everyone's impatience with the Starmers, the Streetings, the Reeves, previous to that generation, the Blairs and the Mandelsons, who of course are still hovering around the cabinet. But as I think the best contributions have tried to make clear again tonight, the Labour Party and the Labour movement are very much bigger than those individuals. Those individuals seem to characterise the Labour Party at any one time. But Starmer is no different to Corbyn in that respect. Corbyn was a left-wing leader of the party who emerged as a small spark to, as John says, to articulate a yearning amongst the general public for something more radical, more transformative. But Corbyn no more summed up the Labour Party than Starmer or Blair or any of the other leaders. And I think we are lapsing into a little bit of pessimism when, as some comrades have said in the chat box, we regard these people as unassailable and undefeatable, simply because, pardon me, at this precise moment, they control the bureaucracy and the machinery of the Labour Party. I think there's a wee bit of wishful thinking that goes on there on occasion. People have been expelled. People don't want to invest in the Labour Party, so they seek alternatives that we are simply not in the objective position to carry through in any meaningful way. I do think, though, and last thing, Tina, that I mean, Graham says this every week. We say it every week, that the elephant in the room, which forces our hand and makes the stakes so much higher than they've ever been before, is the climate emergency. We do not have the luxury of time, you and I. And I think if the Labour Party are going to run into an existential conflict with the trade union movement, and I think that is coming because they're going to inherit an economy that is a mess. Their timid commitments are going to run into political reality and economic reality quite quickly. And I think we've got a trade union movement who are not prepared to extend Starmer a blank cheque. So there are going to be battles. What I fear, though, and we should all be cognizant of this, is that come that moment, you and I are not going to have an agreed platform to demand of that Labour government and to, in many ways, break that Labour government. I agree with Steve that I think we need to be more disruptive. I think we need to be less polite as a movement. And the crisis is so deep that I don't think we can afford that. But there is a real danger if we accept, and I think it's the most reasonable prognosis of what's to come, that a Labour government are going to run into very sharp class conflict with the very class it's meant to be representing and people have illusions in. At that juncture, we need to have a political programme that we can put to people and say, this is the alternative. Because there is also the danger, and we've kind of only alluded to it briefly tonight, if those illusions in a Labour government are smashed, people don't necessarily turn to the left. They can just as easily become demoralised, or even worse, turn to the far right. So if at that moment there is a vacuum of an agreed political agenda, I think we may have cause to look back in that moment with some regret. So part of what we need to be thinking of, inside or outside the Labour Party, when those conflicts come, what can we agree on as a popular, viable and transformative programme that we can present as an alternative?
I would call it a Marxist program, but I guess that would, again, open up some differences amongst us. I think it was a really interesting discussion. There's a lot of fluidity. I think we agreed with that one. Things can change very, very quickly in this period. And I think what we also have to do is divide, in the same way that we need to break the working class from labourism, we also need to break the working class from their trade union misleaders. And that is a problem, that there is no democracy in the trade union movement, and that the trade union members also need to overthrow their leaders and fight for democracy in the trade union movement, because, and there's been a few comments like that in the chat, and quite right, the trade union leaders have a lot to gain from staying with Starmer and staying with that outlook, and that is a struggle we also have to focus on. Comrades, thank you very much for participating. Okay, Roger, I know Roger's really got his hand up. I know we're running a bit late. Okay, come on, Roger. You have been mentioned quite a few times. Let's have you a few more minutes.
Comrade, I'd just like to say I think it's been a very healthy discussion and a very enlightening one. I'm not going to try to reply to the points now, but could I make a suggestion that we have a future meeting where I could expand a bit more on the position that I'm putting forward?
Yeah, and Nick Rack, getting him along would be also very useful, I think, to have a proper debate like that. Brilliant. Thanks very much, comrades. I'm not sure we come to much agreement, but we've certainly outlined all the fights and the tasks ahead, and there were quite a lot of them. Nick's already said yes. Brilliant. Excellent. Let's put that together. Thank you, comrades. Have a good evening. And next week, in the next Red Line TV program, we're probably going to discuss the situation in Iran. If we're not doing this show, we'll have to discuss it tomorrow. Okay, comrades. See you soon. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.